What if a move designed to project total dominance ended up doing the exact opposite? What if a pressure campaign built to intimidate, force hesitation, and bend an ally into compliance didn't just fail, and then see you but she triggered a geopolitical reversal so fast that the entire balance of power shifted in real time? Because that is exactly what the world may have just witnessed. Not just another political disagreement. Not another viral headline. Not another clash of personalities. This became something much bigger. Arkafichi free, not cheese Dutch. System-level geopolitical shockwave that exposed the hidden limits of power, pressure, intimidation, and control in modern politics. And the most important part? It happened to Kanchino Kyang Sing Chi for Indaten King. With cameras rolling, markets watching, allies calculating risk, and global institutions immediately reassessing what comes next. Washington, one move, one response. One miscalculation so significant that it didn't merely miss its target. It reversed the entire dynamic. And if you blinked, you may have missed the precise second the confrontation stopped being about force and started becoming about credibility. Because this was supposed to follow a very familiar playbook. A loud, forceful, headline-dominating maneuver. The kind of move built on the assumption that pressure creates compliance, speed creates confusion, and dominance forces submission. For years, that model has often worked. Hit first, hit loud, define the narrative before anyone else can react. Force opponents into emotional responses, push them into outrage, pull them into escalation, make them fight on your terms. That is where leverage is usually created. But this time, the formula ran into something very different. It ran into a structure, Kiso, because when the confrontation between Donald Trump and Mark Carney exploded into public view, the expectation was obvious. Pressure would build. The response would be emotional. The aggressor would own the tempo. But instead, Carney's response changed the entire equation. No panic. No theatrical outrage. No rushed escalation. What came back was something far more dangerous in high-stakes politics, measured control. And that is the moment the script flipped. Because when one side is trying to dominate the emotional atmosphere and the other side refuses to enter that emotional arena, the entire psychology of power changes. The noise loses force. The pressure stops compounding. The spectacle starts looking less like strength and more like exposure. That is exactly what made this confrontation so significant. Carney's response was never built for the immediate news cycle. It was built for institutional confidence. For investors, for allied governments, for multinational corporations, for diplomatic partners, for voters trying to determine which side actually looked safer, steadier, and more capable under pressure. And that is where the real reversal began. Because the moment the response landed, the conversation stopped being about how few and how far Trump might go. And gedunding sound sambans and started becoming about whether Trump had triggered a chain reaction he could no longer fully control. That is the turning point. That is when a pressure campaign stops being leverage and starts becoming liability. Because intimidation only works if it produces hesitation. It only works if fear materializes on the other side. But when the answer is calm, structured, and credible, something dangerous happens for the aggressor. Confidence rises on the opposing side. Doubt begins spreading on your own. And once doubt enters the system, it moves quickly. Carney appeared to understand the real audience wasn't just Trump. It was everyone watching the consequences unfold. Financial institutions assessing volatility, allies judging stability, businesses calculating supply chain risk, diplomatic channels evaluating strategic fallout. Political insiders reassessing the cost of escalation. So instead of responding to rhetoric, he responded to risk perception. That is why this landed so hard, because it reframed the confrontation from a battle of strength into a test of responsibility, from dominance versus weakness to stability versus volatility. Now, and once the story becomes about stability, the rules completely change. Now, the question is no longer who sounds stronger. It becomes who looks safer to trust with the consequences. That is an entirely different game. And it directly disrupted the underlying mechanics of Trump's pressure strategy. Because tempo is everything in that model. Move fast, strike hard, create confusion, force mistakes, turn those mistakes into leverage. But Carney refused the tempo. He slowed the confrontation down. He forced observers to focus on consequences, on costs, on market reaction, on diplomatic fallout. I say decode on cross-border credibility. And once people begin calculating costs, the illusion of effortless dominance begins to weaken. Suddenly, this is no longer about political theater. It becomes about market confidence. And supply chain risk to U.S.-Canada relations. And investor trust. And the diplomatic credibility. And such alliance stability. And these are arenas where volume alone rarely wins. These are arenas where trust wins. That is why Carney's background mattered so much in this moment. He understands systems. He understands institutions. He understands how markets process uncertainty. And in geopolitical conflict, that knowledge can become a strategic weapon. Because while one side may have been aiming for headlines, the other side was aiming for Angxi and Dao and long-term confidence architecture. And confidence is one of the most valuable currencies in global politics. But what the public saw was only the visible layer. The bigger impact unfolded behind the scenes. The moment Carney answered pressure with control, the internal machinery changed. Advisors began recalculating fallout. Corporate leaders began assessing downside risk. Diplomatic channels intensified. Legal teams reviewed contingency scenarios. Strategic war rooms shifted from how do we apply more pressure to how do we contain the consequences? That is the pivot most audiences never get to see. When offense suddenly becomes defense, when momentum stalls, when uncertainty replaces inevitability. That is when strategies begin to unravel. And once a threat fails to generate the intended result, it permanently loses some of its power. The mystique weakens. The assumption of guaranteed dominance cracks. What once looked like control starts to look like instability risk. That is a dangerous transition for any political identity built around strength projection. Because real control is not what you say. It is what happens after you say it. And what happened next only reinforced the perception that something had gone wrong. Media analysis shifted from spectacle to consequence. Financial voices entered the conversation. Political allies became quieter, more measured, more cautious. And in moments like this, silence is never neutral. Silence means recalibration. Silence means hesitation. Silence means stakeholders are waiting to assess how deep the fallout may become. This moment revealed something deeper than a tactical mistake. It exposed the limits of a strategy many assumed was still unstoppable. It showed that pressure is not absolute. It depends entirely on the psychology of the response. And now there is a visible template for how that cycle can be broken. That changes future negotiations, future diplomatic confrontations, future political escalation models. Because once the world sees that intimidation can be neutralized without chaos, everyone adapts. And that may be the biggest consequence of all. This wasn't just resistance. It was a structural transformation in how modern political pressure can be countered. A moment where dominance met discipline, where volume collided with credibility, where force met system awareness. And in this round, system awareness won. The next move now carries even more weight. Escalation risks reinforcing instability. Pullback risks appearing checked. Narrative reset becomes increasingly difficult once the public conversation shifts from strength to consequence. That is why this moment is still unfolding. Its real impact is not over. It is now moving through boardrooms, alliance networks, diplomatic planning circles, and political strategy rooms around the world, because this was not merely a clash. It was a signal that the old rules may no longer be enough, that in modern geopolitics, power requires more than volume. It requires precision, consequence awareness, system literacy, and credibility under pressure. And that may be the lesson world leaders are taking from this confrontation right now. So here's the real question. Did Carney just expose the limits of Trump's pressure strategy, or is this only the beginning of a much bigger geopolitical escalation? Drop your analysis in the comments below. And for deep global political breakdowns, economic conflict analysis, and system-level power shifts before they dominate mainstream headlines, make sure you subscribe to BCC News, turn on notifications, and stay ahead of the stories shaping tomorrow's world. Because at BCC News, we don't just cover the clash. We decode the power behind it into your